And Scott, do you mind if I pass the con to you?
I'm not going to be here long enough.
Klaus, would you like to have the con?
Okay.
Cool. And I've got to go on an active call, but thank you very much. Oh, good. Yay. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for coming. I have to drop off the call. I'm on a different call right now.
Okay, cool.
Okay. So I have the participants. Okay, so all right, well, good morning.
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 We actually didn't have a topic, did we?
No.
No, and I have a bunch of other things I need to be doing, but just my own 2 cents on the topic. I actually used AI to simplify the topic suggestion because when I
Okay.
tried to read it, I couldn't make any sense of it. And it was discouraging for me because I thought, well, I don't want to be part of that call because I can't even understand the topic suggestion. And so I asked it to simplify, and then I asked it to simplify again. It took 2 levels of simplification for it to get to a level where I could, oh, I understand sort of what the suggestion is. So
And
that,
what is the suggestion?
well, it started, I believe there was a humanity AI enabled neo learning to address compound questions about the systemic psychopathic power abuse dynamics. And I'm trying to actually make sense of that because I would like to participate in a meaningful way. And when I read that, I think I'm not even sure what that means. And then so I simplified it down and I simplified it down again to try to get to where I could actually look at it and say, oh, okay, that's that's what it, and just as kind of a fun thing, when I said for the second round, make this understandable for a sixth grader, how can we make a new system that is fair and good for everyone instead of just making money? How can we stop media from spreading wrong information and causing people to fight? And I thought, oh, I can read that, understand it, and know how to participate in that, whether I'd like to or not. But that was just a suggestion that sometimes I read our topics and I think, I don't even know what to do with this. And so maybe I'll participate and maybe I won't. And those are some of the days that I don't show up. So that's just my own little feedback. So no, I don't have a topic for today.
Okay. Simplification.
Could I respond to that?
Yeah, please, because I read your thing. Yes, please. I'm sorry.
That's fine. The thing about, and I'll put, I don't know whether you looked at the article where it came from. I can't remember whether you did or not, but I did exactly what you said. And the issue about compound questions is the design so that you can't understand them. Now that sounds paradoxical, but let me explain the reason for that. Because of complexity, we have so many moving parts. It's very difficult for our minds to get our head around it. And that's exactly what I do with compound questions. I start by taking it down to 12th grade and 6th grade level and doing exactly what you're saying. Then you can start going up and think, well, how can I enhance my thinking skills to go about it? Now, this goes against everything that people have been taught in business school, marketing, and whatever, because of the KISS principle. Now, KISS principle does have its merit, but, the KISS principle can also be stupid. So the question is, how can we use AI in a sophisticated way that enables us to explore complexity and break it down into pieces exactly like you just described? And so this is a different learning paradigm. So people, have antibody reactions to it because it doesn't fit their mindset of how we're supposed to go about learning. So it's about metacognition and meta learning as well. So I applaud you for doing exactly what the article did. I'd be interested in comparing. We don't have to even talk about this as far as I'm concerned. I'm just putting up an old.
I think it's a fascinating subject, and And here's why. There's a concept that can be captured in a word. That's how we communicate. If we choose to use a word that is 4 or 5 syllables, that adds a level of complexity. It also adds a level of nuance because maybe the 1-syllable word is too broad or doesn't really capture the idea. And what I fear is that the great idea that could be contained in this statement or these questions is lost on the vast number of people because they are not able to decode the language that is used. And so I wonder, how can you preserve the meaning? And I understand, as you simplify, you get rid of some of the nuance and complexity. That's what you're doing. And then as you make it more specific and more robust and more mirroring the complexity of reality, the question becomes a compound question with long, precise technical terms because that can be more accurate. And I wonder what gets, if we're able to actually not able to communicate in a way that the receiver can understand, is all of that great thinking for naught and the learning
There are
potential for naught.
There are really two components here, right? One is your understanding of what you're trying to express and whatever complexity that has, and then the receiver's way of understanding what you're talking about, putting what you're saying into the context of the individual, right? So when we translate something into 6th grade or 10th grade context, that means you are communicating a broad concept to an individual whose development is and vocabulary and cognitive understanding is at that level, is at is embedded within a worldview where that makes sense. And if you are adding more complexity to it, you're losing that individual. Right now they understand nothing because it escapes. So I think that this is coming back to audience specific. I know you're working on this as well, Scott. Now, so to communicate audience specific and put communication into context. But we have Team Purple Sarah here, and Sarah, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm based in the UK. I met Jerry through a Siemens Energy entrepreneurship program, which I was helping with. So I'm from Siemens Energy. And yeah, I'm here to listen and learn. And I actually wanted to add something to what you've said. Do you think that sometimes I feel like people speak in a very highly intellectual manner to be seen as highly intellectual? Do you think
Oh
that's
yeah. Yes,
do
they
you think
do.
that's also
Whether they
part of the
admit it or
reason?
not, they do.
So maybe that might be, I don't know, maybe to add to that, there's like another layer of subconscious kind of, we care about how we're seen. And that might add another barrier in between how other people can actually understand us because we have that there. But yeah, that's just my 2 pennies. But it's lovely to meet everyone.
I have a very specific comment about that. And this is why, Rick, this has been an interest of mine for 9 years now. So there was an instance where the political debates in the US became very low level in the language. And I thought there was a lot of criticism. The language being, I mean, why it's all dumbed down, it's all simplified. And I found a literacy study, I guess every
Yep.
10 years or so, there's a literacy analysis that's done that looks at the population and puts them in 5 levels of literacy. And what was fascinating about this study was that for the first time ever, they took level 4 and 5 and combined them because there weren't enough people in level 5. And I thought, we can complain about that. We can argue that we all need to be more literate, but the reality is that the majority of our audience is not at the same level. And so whether we are consciously or unconsciously doing that, what we're doing is we're saying something literally in another language
Right.
because those words are not
Yeah.
available. And so that's why it's interesting to me to see if the AI that you're talking about can synthesize those ideas and well, translate, I think is a better word, Klaus.
Right.
Translate those ideas without losing so much fidelity that the
Exactly.
idea isn't valid anymore. But to Klaus's point, you have to bring people along. I heard it said once you can talk about watering a tree, or you can talk about the cellular structure and the hydraulic pressure and it's still the same concept, but it's been adjusted so that people can learn and develop. What is it? Zone of proximal development. You meet someone
Right.
just
Yeah.
ahead of
Just
where they
about.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's
Well-
enough for me.
Well, I
Yeah.
was just going to add that while we're talking level of literacy, I looked that up within the last year, and the current US level of literacy is 4th grade. So we're shooting over the head of most of the people there. And it caused me to really think about, because I enjoy big words and the complexity of words, and it caused me to really think about changing my mode of communication to make it more easily understood by the people who are listening to me who have different skill sets. But that's scary
I
to me.
love how
because-
you said that so much, Judith. Changing your mode of communication, which is exactly how we all speak, instead of changing how I talk. Like we don't even realize we say
Yep.
it that way. That's perfect.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to throw that in because I was really disappointed in that statistic. But it explains a lot of what's going on that we see in the media, because that means pretty much that people can't even read the newspaper because that's usually written
Exactly.
at 7th or 8th grade level. So the only communication they have is oral communication with friends or oral media. And we know the weaknesses of oral media. So it caused me to really ponder what to do next.
Daisy,
So
you
it's-
do a lot of communication on Facebook, and so you do your translations into different metaphors and using what's. Do you have different audiences on Facebook, or is this a homogeneous audience?
Were you asking me?
Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't sure if you said Stacy or they see. Okay. Definitely different audiences. Although I got to be honest, I've been staying away. It's right now, it's not worth being there.
yeah, I agree.
If I could just pick up on Sarah's point about, the complexity of language, and I agree with everyone. I mean, the 54% of the US population is only reading a 6th grade reading level. Internationally, when I last look at US is 36th in the world for literacy level. So to me, that speaks to educational inequities, which is a massive problem. And so, in terms of adjusting things down, I agree with you that we have to go beyond grade reading level. And one of the paradigm shifts that I'm suggesting is we get away from this notion of communication, of content to fit into their worldview. It's important, but insufficient. What's even more important than communication is dialogue. How do we engage in conversations with people? Which is far more powerful than thinking that I have to impart something to another person about how I view the world and vice versa. Does it fit into their worldview and vice versa? Because that is more of a transactional encounter and not a generative dialogue where you can actually get nuanced understandings may evolve depending upon where the various partners are in the conversation. So we need to shift from that mindset to what I'm calling a process orientation, which is different from a traditional content way of doing things, particularly for symbolic capitalism, whose status depends upon their intellectual prowess, their ability to talk off the cuff, which is very important for that niche of people who can understand what they're talking about, but we have to get down to people where they're at. And I just came from an invisible call where I'm talking with people, all sorts of levels. It's fascinating when you're in a heterogeneous group of people where the literacy level is variable, which means you have to learn and listen to what they're saying and see if you can put it in a way that it might open the door of inquiry so that people begin to start questioning themselves and questioning others in a conversational way so that we're not divided as much as we are. Anyway, I've said enough, but I'll let other people rebound off of that.
Daisy actually has her hands up.
I'll just add really quickly off of what Rick said, that for me, what I observe, it's the listening part that's missing in a lot of people, especially those people that think they know more and that they want to communicate. They skip the part of listening. And just as far as the reading thing goes, I've noticed that even very intelligent people that might have, they might read at a high level, they don't have the lawyering part where when they're reading something, they're not aware they didn't actually say this, like the technicality parts. And I find that with people in this group, sometimes not right here necessarily, but especially when they're talking politics, they're not really in a court of law. They would not win. That's the best way I could put it.
Yeah, the logic is missing. Yeah. Sarah, you have your hand up.
I'm seeing this from the opposite side of what I originally said now, is that if we simplify our speech, would that condition people to be trapped into their type of communication? For example, like, let's say the youth who are in schools, if we start to speak to them in a really simplistic manner, just so they can understand, would that push them away from being eloquent in the future? I thought that might be also a point to make. I don't know.
If I could add to what Sarah just said real quickly, because I think the idea is to have a beginning point, and then through conversation, you grow it together so that everybody knows what they're talking about from the beginning.
Maybe another important point here is that a conversation has to be also vertical, right? So there is the need to explain a concept on the one hand in this lawyer kind of way. So to prove you're accurate, right? I mean, to bring in the kind of language that substantiates that this is accurate, but then translate this into the sixth grade or levels we talked about. But then that sixth grader language has to now trust, right? I mean, because there is information missing in that communication that you would need to really prove the point, right? So unfortunately, what happened, what is happening now, and what has happened with the social media context and with this entire Trump administration coming through, there is a lot of very deceptive communication happening at this 4th and 6th grade level, but it's based on trusting the wrong people, right?
Right.
And so, how do you cut through that? I think is a real challenge. Rick, you got your hand up.
Yeah, Sarah, I think what you're pointing out is a polarity between oversimplistic and over-sophisticated. And the question is, where's the fulcrum point in any conversation with anybody that you're actually moving towards increasing sophistication rather than simplification? And I use the KSSS principle, which is keep sophistication this side of simplicity, which is how do you gradually elevate the mutual learning that can go on by that sort of collaborative dialogue. And there isn't a script for this, that you can have some simple rules that you can follow, but when you get into a dynamic emergent dialogue, it evolves because you're learning from each other. And so it's a completely, that's why I call it neo-learning. We don't have enough neo-learning to co-elevate our virtues and understanding how our values divide us. And unless we start having a better way of talking about this, we're going to be stuck in this dysfunctional polarization and toxic divisiveness.
Yeah.
And we're still going the downward spiral. And if we've got to reverse that downward spiral.
Okay, Judy.
Well, I was just going to add that I think one of the points that I think is most central to this is actually understanding. And I find that frequently in conversations that are challenging, regardless of the complexity of the topic, asking a question that's loaded with sort of help me understand X is very helpful in elucidating from multiple people, because other people will chime in. They'll have seen something different than what the first speaker said in the context, and they'll add to it. And so I think there's a piece here about shared understanding that's a social value that is neglected sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's challenging. I was looking at this morning, Washington Post has an article. They're tracking 20 Trump voters over time and what they are thinking, and those are sort of working people, and by and large they think that he's doing exactly what I would want him to do, and he's doing exactly what I voted for him to do. Now you try to explain the impact of the tax bill on them, and it just bounces off. It just doesn't. It just doesn't penetrate. So yeah. So because they're listening to arguments from people they trust that say everything is fine and this is exactly what it should be.
Right.
Scott.
I would like to ask Kevin to weigh in, because I'm realizing, if for little of what I know of you, Kevin, that you have a lot of experience helping people in some troubled areas learn practical, relevant skills. And so they're developing sophistication in an area that's relevant to them, how to manage a business or whatever it happens to be. And I'm wondering if maybe we're asking them to be sophisticated on something that they don't need to be sophisticated on because that's not relevant to them. Or what, have you seen anyone who wasn't able to increase their sophistication in an area that was useful and relevant?
Well, that's interesting. So if the goal is increasing sophistication, I almost never in the work I do run into people who have that as a goal.
Maybe defining sophistication as ability to handle greater complexity, potentially. I don't know. Maybe that.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Kevin, though. I think people don't think about the complexity. They sit in their chair from their point of view, and they hear it through their internal filters. And it's sort of up to the speaker to try to guesstimate how to effectively share a thought with a diverse group of people. And that's what I find challenging in groups.
Yeah, with the people I work with, I mean, the main problem is do-gooders with a solution. I mean, it's like I want to. They need to be sprayed with glyphosate. You need Roundup when the do-gooders come in the door, because they have solutions, and the solutions are toxic for the most part. And getting to a point where you understand the people without power responding to the people with resources in ways that the people with resources can be trusted enough to hear a good response is the biggest thing I run into, right? I mean, they have to tell the funder what the funder wants. And so, they're going to one level of resources. 90+% of the best money from foundations goes to white nonprofits, and that's unrestricted operating income. And that's money that comes in and it has trust attached, and you trust them to have the solution. But by African Americans and groups led by natives get less than 10% of that money. They get these things called program grants, where at least 30 to 40% is put up to solve the theory of change of the funder to make them happy. And you get all kinds of mission creep. And then they send in their consultants to make sure you're doing it the way they want you to do it. And you're framing the problem they want you to do it. And they don't give you any money to deal with the intrusion cost of their consultants who stop you from doing the work. So I think it's the power assumptions around the people with resources that, or solutions, and the people with resources think of themselves as having solutions, but they haven't asked people like, what the hell do you want? You know, I mean, so getting to the point of where somebody without resources will tell you what the actual problem is, because there's so much risk of speaking truth to power when you don't have money or power, and someone is coming in to try to help you. And if you disappoint the people who want to help you, you don't get the little bit that, a great example is this thing called Well of Water. And it was a bright young Stanford woman, won an award, and she solved the problem of women walking an hour and a half to the well with water on their heads in jugs. And she gave them these rubber barrels with rollers. And they said, thank you, that's so wonderful. Well, she didn't ask that an hour and a half without, while they're going to the wells, was the only time they were free of the patriarchy. And so that's where the women did the work of the village and talked about this guy that needed to be put down in a way that could be put down. And they loved the barrels because they were useful. You know, they didn't give up that time, but you know, Africans are better than African Americans in saying thank you to white folks, giving them gifts, because after they leave, they always leave, you can use the barrels that are left behind, the handles that are left behind. But they didn't ask, what time are we saving? They were trying to save their only free time that was free of the patriarchy. And that to me is like a picture of aid, a picture of social enterprise, a whole lot of things. Because it's, you know, the assumption behind all of this conversation is that the people here have answers that they need to communicate. That's been the subtext of everything here. And it's like, well, you know, not really. I don't think that's really true. I don't know what the rednecks in Swanano need. You know, I'm around them, and we meet at the farmers markets and things like that. But you know, the assumption that the people here have answers that and solutions. You know, what are you doing in your lives that makes you think that you have solutions for other folks? Show me the work that you're doing that makes you think that, and then we'll go. But you know, the subtext here is, how do we get them? It's like, you know, it's in the category of things that, how do we get people who are not in the room to do things they don't seem to want to do that we want them to do? Well, you know, I try to avoid those discussions because it's, you know, they're always the same. And they don't ever, you know, they go in the same circles. But sorry, Scott, that's my answer. It's like, you know, the assumption that you have the answer is really what makes you dangerous.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think we often ask the wrong question.
Yeah, I know. There was a great thing, a guy in Kenya who was really effective said he was asked an African once, can you get to Nairobi this way? And I said, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. And then he asked, he had learned to say, would you go to Nairobi that way? So, oh no, it's 12 days longer. But he was not safe to answer the white man of, can you get, yes, you can get to Nairobi that way. And the answer has to be yes, right? I mean, the answer, if you have no power and they have money and they're coming with a solution, you have to answer yes. And they give you shit that gets in the way.
You know, I just certified as a SCORE volunteer. If you know SCORE is attached to the Small Business Bureau, They just lost all their funding on top of me. This is now but different topic. But SCORE subscribes to a concept called SLATE, and they really teach when you go through the training program. You go SLATE, and SLATE is stop, listen, assess, right? And that's really I think it's just a wonderful way to engage, right?
Yeah, my good friends at Mortar in Cincinnati, sorry to go on, they're a Black Run accelerator. They had SCORE volunteers, and they had to come up with another curriculum to detoxify the SCORE volunteers, which was culturally appropriate technical assistance. When you have, because they have so many folks in Cincinnati, they're former Kroger execs and they're former Procter and Gamble execs, and they come in to talk to non-college Black female entrepreneurs, and they want to apply Six Sigma done through SCORE. And and so they had to get to. It's a really good, and it's been applied around the country. It's a culturally appropriate technical assistance to help well-meaning SCORE execs who are former executives, right? It's retired executives coming to help. Oh God, what do we do? Get them to learn what they don't, how they don't ask the right questions, and they have to learn to think differently. So I mean, SCORE became a good partner after 3 or 4 years of trying to inflict their curriculum on the folks at Mortar in Cincinnati. And if you want to, I mean, Mortar in Cincinnati has a way to make SCORE executives not as terrible when they come out.
Yeah, I mean, I thought their training program was amazing. I mean, I really appreciated going through it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it's probably improved.
Yeah. Rick, you got your hand up.
Yeah, Kevin, I would make the assumption that you made that everyone in this room has the answers. So I just want to challenge that assumption that you made. I have no idea whether people think that or not. So I think you have to be careful about overgeneralizations about things that you feel strongly about. I totally agree with you that what you said earlier, that people come in with experts, imposition, the broken model of philanthropy. No problem with that. But I think it's an overgeneralization to say that we
Exactly.
all
Not
have.
all white people, Rick. Sure, got it.
Well, I'm talking about everyone. I'm not exclusive to whites. I'm including all races, all people. And so I just simply say I have a different point of view, and I'll leave it at that. But actually, one thing that Judith mentioned that caught my ear, because it reminded me of an article I wrote back in 1992, and I had to go look it up to remind myself what I'd written over 30 years ago. And it's a model of doctor-patient relationship, which is generalizable to groups as well. And I'll just describe it because I had to go back and remind myself. I think I can remember what I wrote 30 years ago, which is relationship building. That is foundational, having trust, agenda setting. And typically agenda setting is not shared. It's imposed by other people or people forcing their own agenda on other people. Then assessment of what's going on. Enhancing mutual understanding and problem clarification, because we may have different perspectives on what we see the problems, and we have to have some mutual understanding about it. Otherwise, we don't have any middle ground to move forward. Then trying to work out what you're going to do about it, and then bring it to closure. And I mean that's an implicit model that I've worked with all my professional career. And I start off with, what's your agenda?
So many recipes. Yeah, I mean, we got plenty of recipes, but in the execution.
Well, I would say the heuristic, different types of heuristics, and there's variations on the theme of that. But if you're truly learned-centered or patient-centered, or even better still, person-centered, then you work from the context of the other person and understand their worldview, and then go from there.
Right. Dave, you have been super quiet here.
I was just thinking there are many forms of intelligence, and linguistic intelligence is only one. And I think I would say maybe let's not conflate someone's level of eloquence and literacy with their intelligence. That's all. That's my only thought right now.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
totally appreciate that. Yeah.
I've tried to understand other people's points of view. And, I'm a highly successful serial entrepreneur, straight white guy, and that's going to be my point of view. And so I try to follow. I go to places I'm invited, and I try to. At this point, I'm following African American women I work with, and then do what I'm, directed to do. And at my age, I'm finding it much more fruitful to be a follower instead, and not be the strategic leader. And just because my repeated habit of success made me increasingly less successful when I tried to work in community.
Funny thing about that, isn't it?
I mean, yeah.
So
How about leading
so
with questions? That's
so
something that I learned to do with senators and congressmen. I mean, I came out of MIT thinking, I know science, I can explain it to all these lawyers. They don't know. It doesn't work. But if I could come in and just guide them with questions. So, they have some idea that somebody's whispered in their ear. And sometimes it sounds so good to them and it seems like a great headline. And I just have to say, well, what will happen when so-and-so sees that press release? And oh yeah.
hint, hint.
And is there a better way that you might phrase that so that you could welcome some other opportunities to solve this problem? And then, after about 5 questions, they say, well, I have another idea, which is exactly what I would have told them to do.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I haven't seen a guidebook for doing that. I'm sure they exist. It's not the Socratic method to get law students to learn. It's actually how to get more powerful people to do the rational thing or at least think through all the consequences of what they're thinking they want to do.
Yeah.
There is a book on that. It's called Humble Inquiry by Edgar Schein.
How old is that?
How old is the book?
Yeah.
Maybe 10 years old.
Okay, I'll look for that. And Schein, SH.
EIN, I think.
SCH.
SCHEIN. He's
Yeah.
yeah.
Thanks.
I know Doug wanted to say something, but I just want to real quickly, because Judith earlier was talking about, she said something that connects, and I wanted to say it's worthy of a whole conversation to find out when that block comes in that stops the inquiry. That's a separate conversation that I think it's worthy to focus on, because there is something that happens, a dynamics in a group that stops the questioning, and we need to stop ignoring it. And Doug, I'll let you go.
Yeah, no, I just, I've spent the last 10 years on this question, like how do we do us better, and in the context of conversation, like connection and communication in the trenches. So I don't have a prescription or framework or letter code, number code, or other, hypothesis or thing to put on the table. But it takes a lot of space and time to actually hear another person, for them to hear you, before you even get to understanding the other person and them understanding you.
Yeah.
Before you get to the, what are we talking about? And is your understanding of these words the same as my understanding of these words? Before we get to what's to be done about it. And everybody jumps to like chapter 5.
Yep.
And as long as that's the modus operandi, you have a bunch of isolated, disconnected atoms bumping around in the same space. And it's sort of miraculous that as a species we produce anything in that state. But we do somehow. And there's huge value when you start at chapter 1, when you start in the beginning of that process and really open up to doing it differently. And I'm now experiencing a whole different quality and depth and richness of experience with, a partner, with some folks that, that we serve as support and it's not, we're not consultants, but we're more insight providers, and people that I'm partnering with in new undertakings where there's a generosity to take that time, and if and when somebody is tickled, which is my name for trigger, whether it's a mild conceptual thing or whether it's a heartfelt trauma revisited in the instant and everything in between, when somebody's triggered, that's recognized. That person has just left the arena, and that's the first order of business: is what just happened and what was their experience and how do we return them to the team as fast as possible before we move on. And everything I'm describing, the current paradigm and world doesn't have time or patience for. So anybody in any context that suggests, hey, wait a minute, will generally get run over or ignored. So it is possible to do it differently, but boy, does it need to slow down a whole lot to enable what I'm describing to actually manifest. And I'm complete.
Jerry, we have been, how do you summarize what we have been talking about? It's to hear and be heard, and
Nice.
sort of thing. How do you communicate across different strata of folks you're interacting with? And the challenge that all comes with it.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so, Scott, you're up.
So to address what Doug was saying, I have a counterpoint. It's an experience that I had with one of my former managers, and she was incredibly action-oriented, wonderful woman, and she would act, take feedback, adjust, act, take feedback, adjust. And I would sit on my office and think and plan and ponder and work it all out. And in the end, we kind of realized that it takes us both about the same amount of time to get to the result. Her way is like this, but she gets there. My way is a little more direct, but it takes me a lot longer to start to get going. And in the end, it was like, I don't think one of these is better or worse than the other. I feel better when I align and plan and all of that, but the outcome wasn't better. And when I would think about her as wasting time going this way, yeah, but she would also come back the other way and find the place. And so it's just a counterpoint on having that long, planful conversation might be more trait aligned than need aligned.
Okay, Jerry, it's yours.
All right, you're passing the con. Good. You're doing such a good job, Klaus. Rick, off to you.
Thank you, Doug. I just want to say there was one word you used that I reacted against, and I'll tell you the reason why. You said insight provider. And in healthcare, they talk about providers. I dislike the term. I don't think I'm a provider. I'm a practitioner. And so it's languaging. And in fact, what you triggered for me was insight generator, which is how can we enable people to develop their insights into whatever they're, working with. And I want to introduce two concepts. Actually, there are three concepts here. One comes from some Black scholars in the Black female scholars in the 1990s, talking about cultural humility. And at that time, there was a lot of talk about cultural competence. And I remember thinking, I don't like that term at all. I don't think I'm culturally competent. I'm incompetent most of the time, which really, I mean, I'm knowledgeable, but I still feel I'm never going to be culturally competent in somebody else's culture. You're always learning, and never liked it. And when these female Black scholars came out with this construct, cultural humility, it immediately resonated with me. I thought, oh, this is much better. So that's one construct. The other is moral humility, which is another. And another one coming from family therapy training, which I had, is what's called the one down position. And the one down position is the Columbo approach. It's sort of like, well, help me understand. I mean, whatever. You remember old Columbo, how he was able to solve, crimes because he just worked in a way of not knowing. And through not knowing, he actually got to know what was going on. So I'll put a Perplexity AI link into it if people want to follow any of those rabbit holes on those different areas, because it's something that early in my career had a profound influence on how to address the complexity of other people's lives. So
Thanks, Rick. I was an avid watcher of Columbo back in the day, alas. I'm stepping into the conversation midstream, but I wanted to throw in a thing I've mentioned on a couple of previous OGM calls, which is when I was looking around for what are some good guidelines for running a good society, and I've got a bunch of riffs on that. But the thing I landed on was something I attribute to Thich Nhat Hanh, but I'm not positive it's sort of from him. And it's a deep listening and loving speech. And it seems to me like that's a really, really, really great start for a whole bunch of stuff. So deep listening and loving speech. It's very simple, it's memorable. And if you work from there, it dissolves a lot of other issues. It makes discourse possible. A whole bunch of other things show up. And then I'll mention the second thing because I'm going to blog about it pretty soon, and I'm curious about whether what you would suggest and if you're interested in joining me. But years ago, and I've mentioned this also on a couple of historic OGM calls. Years ago, in a fit of pique, I bought the domain fubarism.com, which looks like that. And the explanation is, I think everybody knows what FUBAR, F-U-B-A-R, means. It's fouled up beyond all recognition, or the worst form of that. It dates back to World War I-ish in the army, et cetera. And foo.bar is a placeholder file name for coders, for programmers. So if you're writing some sample code, you might put foo.bar in the middle of the code as a placeholder. So fubarism.com is a placeholder religion. And the question I'm asking is, if you got to put anything you wanted, if you got to put anything at all into a religion that you would like to adhere to, what would you have it be? What would you have it include? And you could think of this as a cut and paste from existing religions. You could think of this as a philosophical conversation to start from scratch. I don't know. But I'm curious about what people would like what would make a regime worth following? What would you put into it? And the thing that I started with was deep listening and loving speech. That for me is like the first thing I can say. I would love to have like smack in the middle somehow of a religion in air quotes that I would adhere to. Klaus.
Yeah, that's sort of along the lines of the conversation we had earlier, because we talked about how information and understanding is really a vertical, right? So there's a concept that conveys, at a high level, a truth that needs to be communicated, and I use spiral dynamics typically to explain that needs to be communicated across and across the spiral into worldviews that require let's say a 6th grade language or a 10th grade language to come across. So then the clue that links these stages is trust. You need to be able to trust who explains a concept that you may not have the information or the background to fully research and explore. And I think much of the separation that we have right now in our society is caused by an abuse of trust, where people have put themselves into positions of trust. I mean, Trump, famous, gifted for that, and abusing that trust by misinforming, misconstruing that kind of information, and people who do know are disenfranchised and not trusted. Have been basically ridiculed and pushed aside. So how to make that connection is really the challenge. If we ever want to come back together into one, the old story, a house divided cannot stand. If we ever want to bring that house together again, then we have to have a common language that agrees on a common reality. And that's that challenge is, I think, coming a bit clearer in many people's struggle, trying to be heard, trying to hear and be heard. This exchange there. So I see that, and I was explaining earlier. I just got myself certified as a SCORE volunteer, and I love the way they guide you through the SLATE model: stop, listen, assess, right, before you offer any solution. So I think this is a very real challenge to engage in ways that moves aside all this rancor and not the ugliness in conversation, and truly reaches out in ways that connect. And I don't think we have figured out how to do that yet.
Is it slate or slam?
Slate.
Okay, because I just Googled slate with the first couple words and it didn't fill it out, but it did give me slam, which looks like that.
Yeah, it's
So it
similar.
must be different training. Yep.
Yeah, mine is it says slate.
Thanks. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to say that part of this, I think, is a community effort. For the, what I brought up before about finding that thing that stops the conversation. I don't, it's something that to me, it's almost like a social norm. And the only way you can really influence that is socially. And I've actually seen, and I wish Dave was still here, because I've actually seen some people try to do that on the OGM mailing list. At least that's how I perceived it to be. By saying what I assume might have been a little uncomfortable for them to say, but they did it anyway, which is really important. And to the idea of trust, it's easier for me to trust like everybody in this room when they're together and speaking, and there's different people that can push back on different things than if I just was listening to one voice and not having the experience or the understanding to know if it should be trusted. I don't know if I'm making sense of what I'm trying to say. Anybody can feel free to rephrase it.
Anybody with thoughts?
I will say one more piece. The reason I'm saying this here is I personally feel it more in male dominated communities. And I'm saying it to a group of men to remind you to pay attention. And if there's somebody in need, whether they're male or female or adult or child, doesn't matter. But just to remind you that you're a protector of the community in a sense.
Which is a neighboring topic that I'm very interested in, which is about guardianship or stewardship. And what role that plays in masculinity, what role that plays in social construction, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need to go there, but Scott, sorry, Sarah.
On the topic of trust, I'm just thinking whether or not trust links to transparency. But then I realized that it might not be linked to transparency, because when a child that has limited knowledge, if their parent gives them a white lie, keeps them in the dark, that's out of care and that's out of love, and technically they're not being honest. But that still means that the parent is trustworthy. So in my mind, I'm thinking perhaps trust might be to do with character and relationships. And perhaps our modern society leaves less room for trust because it's difficult to create a connection when our community is so big. How are we supposed to connect to a president or a prime minister? Whereas if we had a community leader where there was only about 50 people, we'd be able to trust them more. So it might just be, that might play a role as well.
If I can just comment to that, I think that transparency is a variable or a lever. I just put it in the chat. It doesn't mean that in every trustworthy interaction, transparency must be set at 100%. You can move it around, and that's what a parent does when they say a white lie. It's like, in this case, we're going to just say that gentleman was asleep leaning against the wall. Because they're making a judgment about what's appropriate for the moment, what the child can absorb, whatever else it might be. But I think the transparency is very connected to trust. So just because it doesn't always have to be set at 100 doesn't mean it doesn't relate really well. So I think it works really well there. And then trust operates very differently at different scales. When you have just a couple, just two people, or a married couple, or a small family, or team, trust has all sorts of different weird dynamics at different scales. And what we're seeing at the social scale right now in front of us is the hacking of trust at global scale. And that is a major issue in the world right this minute. We haven't figured out how to overcome the very intentional and clever hacking and undermining of trust that has gone on for decades and decades, and it's causing a bit of a problem right now. I don't know if that helps. Rick?
Yeah, I'd just like to bring up a process observation. It's a little out of context, but it was triggered by some of the conversations we've had so far. And it comes originally from transactional analysis, and a reframing of that is how we share power with people. And there's the one-up position, there's a one-to-one and one-down position, which I mentioned earlier is a family therapy construct. It goes by different names, but you get the gist of it. And one of the, I'm unfortunately, my grandkids have just arrived, so I'm going to have to leave after I drop this question into the chat, which requires a much longer conversation or a line of inquiry, which is how can we use cultural and moral humility and the one down position as antidotes to the one-upmanship of colonial academia and symbolic capitalism. So that is a loaded question. And I think it gets to the issue of power dynamics that you're alluding to, Jerry, by what you just said. So, and it ties in, Stacey, very nicely to what you were saying, in that, when I'm predominantly in a female group and I'm the male, doesn't always happen. The dynamics are different than when you're in the minority. So we need more female voices here to perhaps monitor ourselves in terms of our positional authority and whether we're coming from one up, one to one, or one down.
Thanks, Rick. There's a whole, yeah, it seems like humility is a common thread in the conversation. I'm wondering what we all think about it. Maybe I'll spice up the question a little bit by saying that humility in the current global sphere is not being rewarded very much. It's like brash, testosterone-laden masculinity is being rewarded quite a bit. And I'm wondering what the antidote to that is. And I think the antidote has a lot to do with leading differently. But how do you make it, how does it happen that people can perceive servant leadership or humble leadership or some other variant of leadership as being as powerful, trustworthy, and efficient and effective as the testosterone version? Judy, were you about to say something a moment ago? Let me go to Judy first, because I saw you starting to go when I kind of interrupted. Go ahead.
Well, I think I'm not sure humility is the right word. And I was struggling with that a little bit because I think that everything is so situational that it's difficult to put labels on in any way. And it's sort of, how do you keep a conversation going in the hope that it will go somewhere that leads to additional insight? But you can't do that by making a contrarian statement, and you can't do it by asking a tough question. I end up falling back to help me understand as a neutral term to approach the question to try to elicit more dialogue, because it seems to me that much of our contemporary communication is in a not necessarily conscious way, erecting barriers to the communication that we say we're trying to accomplish.
Thank you. Love that. Doug?
Yeah, there's an assumption in your frame, which is that leadership is required. And I don't subscribe to that necessarily. Somebody who is serving as in a facilitative role by and between others in a co-creative context can just be that. The only way leadership arises is when you then add in that person exerting power, which is projective by definition. So if we wanted to do it differently, then it's not leaderlessness. It's not about that.
Mm-hmm.
It's about not inviting the whole concept or construct to the table, because it's not about stating a negative that it isn't present as if it's required or should be or could be or might be. It's literally not orienting with that in the frame. And that's a different thing than polarizing it, making it a duality. It's not about duality. It's about whether you have to incorporate power into the equation or decide to not.
I think
And
that's, go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
Well, I just think that's a super important point. Leadership is a really deceptive term. And it frequently means more authoritarian content than genuine leadership to invite coherence. And so I just want to reinforce that distinction, because I think we talk about leadership and we mean very vastly different things. And so it's a bad word in a way. And understanding might be the term that should be used much more in order to then be able to share a different new understanding that evolves from participation.
And that does that, and what you just said doesn't require any individual in the equation having power over that process.
Right.
It's not required. It's our system, our society is founded and rooted in it. And so everybody's imprinted and assumes it, like who's leading. And the minute somebody walks in the room and they're attached with the title of that's the facilitator, that's the moderator, that's the whatever, any figure that is anointed in that way literally autonomically shifts everybody else in the room into a whole system embodied reconfiguration where whole systems of discernment and voice and agency are turned off. And the person I'm now looking at is going to tell me what? Tell me everything. And that's like, you know, a cultural psychosis, but it's not a natural order, you know, natural world thing. It's a construct. It's not real, but we perpetuate it. And the thing about the masculine, you know, more women and dominance of white men and all of that stuff is intrinsically rooted in the same thing. So the patriarchy is the patriarchy is the patriarchy. And men in today's society exhibit a distorted masculinity that intrinsically is imbued and contaminated with power. And the divine masculine doesn't have anything to do with power. It has to do with fire and air, which is about clarity, discernment, and energy, bringing energy to task. And none of those things extrapolate to that person exerting or projecting power. So power is the power is the drug that our culture is addicted to. But it needs to be transcended if we're going to actually get to a better place experientially for everybody, as opposed to just white males okay and everybody else a victim. Rant over.
No, Doug, no, not a rant at all. Thank you. My internal definition of leadership is really broad and not stigmatized, meaning for me, humble leadership, servant leadership, whatever, somebody who's not in the leader, doesn't have a title, whatever, might at some point say, hey, let's do this. And to me, that's leadership. So I'm going to ask Judy's question to everybody, kind of help me understand better what you mean by removing the frame of leadership entirely, which sounds enticing to me, but I can't get my brain to do it. I can't get over that hump because to me, the subtlest action of, you know, one amoeba says, hey, there's more sugar on this part of the landscape. Let's head this way, is to me a form of leadership, strangely. So let me go to the queue. Scott?
I agree with you, Jerry. I had a hard time following that, Doug, because I think that the natural world is full of instances of leadership. And power and a leader who has, through whatever dominance hierarchy that particular creature might happen to be part of, they rise to the top. So I don't think it's unnatural at all. But the reason that I wanted to make a comment was you were talking about humility a little while ago, Jerry. Sometimes we have to go back a little ways. I was thinking about Columbo. So when Columbo walked into the room, he didn't assume he knew what was going on and what had happened. We don't want to have detectives that go in there and say, "Oh, I know what happened." It's like, no, you have to be willing to say, "I don't know what's going on here. I'm going to look. I'm going to gather my clues. I'm going to try to make sense of it afterwards." And I think you had said something about how do we change that? And I think that we have done a huge disservice to our society by not teaching people that it's actually just fine to say you're wrong or you made a mistake or I don't know. And I think that we have lost the ability to say that with impunity. Like, maybe that's the wrong word, but it feels like you can't say that without somehow diminishing yourself, when actually, if we understood anything at all about the scientific process and the way things work, we'd know that it's a bunch of guesses. And then we verify and then we change. And most of it changes. And that's because it's not a fact is a fact forever and ever, you know? And so I think, we have to get more comfortable with the idea that I don't know. Let's find out together. Let's explore that. And I think it's very difficult to say that given the way that we raise people these days.
Thanks, Scott. Mike?
Yeah, Jerry, I wanted to also go back to humility, which I think has to be one of the 5 most important pieces of FUBARism. But I'd also add the other thing, which is respect. I mean, the Bible, the New Testament says, love your neighbor as yourself. Love may be a little too far in this current world, but at least respect. And most of our broken politics is because, whether it's true or not, large parts of our population in the United States don't think they're respected and don't think they're heard. And as a result, don't think they're getting a fair shake and that somebody else is getting a piece of the pie and they're not. So we somehow have to convey that respect. And I'm not sure how it's done. It may be that it has to do with the third word, which is truth. One really good way to show that you don't respect me is to lie to me and assume I'll believe it. And it's not just lies from political leaders and from one party. We're seeing lies from advertising, from the church, from clearly from the media, who have determined that the right, well-polished lie can be much more profitable. So I don't know how we get back to that, but it may be that we just have to start protesting in the street with signs that say, "Respect me now, always." Because it's not, whatever we're doing isn't working. But thanks again for FUBARism. I hope you write that up, and I do like the leadership by questioning that Columbo personified.
Mike? Kevin?
Yeah, on leadership, I'm in the position now where really am in a position of following. And so, and I mostly am following outside of, working with my wife, which is a whole other kind of thing. Working with a Black woman I've worked with for about a half a dozen years in Asheville. And she'll often or sometimes say, "Hey, go talk to that powerful white guy and get him to listen to our story and get us in the room." And so I use my privilege to open the door and get in the room and let her tell the story. And so that's following. But then I come in like, I can get us in the door when she is a 60-something Black woman with an amazing track record can't get us in the door. And you use that stuff. And also when we're in the room, I'll make a bigger ask than she'll feel comfortable asking. for? You know, she'll say, give us capacity dollars, and I'll say, give us a bunch of money. And it works that me being in the room with her, having told the story, gets us a bunch of money. And I'd say what the money's for and how he'll measure it, all that stuff. But, you know, the position of not leading and being willing to follow and be directed is not something I was trained in, and it's not something I saw my uncles do that I used as my role model. And it's something I had to learn, and it didn't sit well with my ego for a long time. And so I think, you know, try following rather than leading. You know, it's working for me, and that's just, you know, you got to pick the right person. I've followed some other folks, and we didn't get anywhere because they weren't the right person to follow. And I've had a couple of things where they look like the right person, but I shouldn't. You got to pick the right person to follow. So I've got one now.
Love that, Kevin. Thank you. You're reminding me of a story from long ago. An old colleague of mine from New Science named Nina Buck, who was born in Nainital in India and came to the US, got a degree at MIT, and ended up, after she was my colleague at New Science, she ended up at MIT licensing their technology out. And she would travel to India and go to meetings with people about licensing MIT technology. And those people would talk to her male junior associate. They would not talk to her. And I was just so sad and frustrated. And I was like, how is this, you know, how is this still happening? And it does. And I just thought, like, how do we flip a switch in people's brains so that this is not a thing anymore? Stacy.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that I think like when Doug talks about leadership, I think that there might be an in-between stage before we can get to that. And I think that what Kevin just illustrated is sort of like that in-between stage, because the leader does set the tone, and humility and generosity is going to be dependent upon that leader for where we are right now. You know, the idea would be that Kevin wouldn't have to go and talk to that powerful person because the two women could do it directly. And the only way that I see those things changing is socially. I don't, I mean, unless I don't see any other way unless, I mean, lately I've been watching a lot of TV just to escape. And the characters that I see on TV are absolutely awful, but they're all powerful, rich men who get away with it because everybody around them kisses their ass because let's face it, they all have something to gain. And that's where I think the personal responsibility is. And unfortunately, the early adopters of taking that stance don't have it quite as easy. But if we all did it together, then it could be different.
Thank you. A tiny nuance maybe on leadership, just to add this in, there might be different kinds of leaders in a room, meaning there's the person with a senior title who is a leader in the room. There's the person who's in charge of the meeting who is a leader in the room. But there's the person who's taking notes, and the way they're scribing and actually synthesizing might actually change the nature of the conversation in fruitful ways. And then there's the person who's taking care of the emotional valence of the room and making sure everybody's present and heard from. And that's a form of leadership in the room. And one person could do all these roles, or it might be very distributed. And then there's the person who comes up and offers a better idea than anybody's had in the room, and suddenly becomes the leader because everybody sort of crystallizes and says, oh yeah, let's do that thing. That sounds great. And they become a temporary leader. So I like that. And I'd love to sort of wander this conversation back toward what Doug said very provocatively a moment ago, which is that leadership and power are kind of the drugs that we're and the frames that we're used to using. And if we can release ourselves from those, good things happen. So I'd like to find some way to go back there a bit. Mike. Mike, one of the Mike multitudes. I think you're switching devices. Yes, you are.
I am. I was having terrible problems with unstable network here using the Carnegie system.
I think it has to do with global peace instability, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, we don't have a lot of stability or peace right now, and our air conditioning in our main room doesn't work either. So it's a bad technology week. I'm going to be selfish for 2 minutes and just throw out a question, and if anybody wants to send me an email, that would be wonderful. At midnight tonight, I'm doing a briefing for Australia and India, and the topic is technology impact assessment for peace and stability. So it's a little bit of, how can we work together to explore how new technologies will change the world? And we're specifically focused on the Quad countries, so the US, Japan, India, and Australia. But I'm curious if any of you have seen something good that explains what we don't understand about how countries can work together on technology, particularly leading edge technology, and particularly on futuring about leading edge technology. So, if the kind of thing that the Highlands Forum used to do, and it's a very fuzzy topic. It's the second briefing they've done. And so my main job is to make sure they don't go and launch into a project based on bad models. But anyway, that's my assignment, and I'm sorry again to take things off track. And you can just send me a chat message, or you can send me an email. That would be great. I look forward to briefing you on what I learned, because everybody looks at these issues differently, and particularly if it's Indians, Chinese, Indians, Japanese, and Australians, it should be a fun group. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mike. And
Mike, can you put your email in the chat if that's the channel?
Cool. Always happy to have provocations like that in the room. Klaus.
Yeah, in this vein, Mike, I was really struck with stories about Grok contradicting Elon Musk on multiple occasions now, to the point where he wants to reprogram Grok from the ground on up by reinterpreting the history of man, and so there is something to be said with these AI systems who are inherently logical, right? I mean, the things have to make sense, and they can lie, but then they know why. I mean, there is a logic to this as well, and Elon Musk got contradicted on several instances, and I have had conversations with Grok where I started a conversation on OpenAI and then transferred that over to Grok and asked for its opinion, and it was astounding how real it was. I mean, how it admitted to things that are counterintuitive to a right-wing position, right? So there may be some hope in this technology to straighten the conversation, maybe.
Thanks. Doug, please.
So this thing about the alternative reality, the non-leadership reality, alternative reality. When the woman Kevin is working with said, hey, and presumably Kevin and her are both sort of aligned and united with what she's doing. Like, he's interested in helping her with her vision, and it's sort of their vision. And as a team, looking at, in this situation, who gets us in the door? It's the white guy. And I've been in partnerships where I'm the Jewish guy because the firm we're targeting is Jewish. And if my Gentile partner knocked on the door, it just would not happen. That's not me leading. That's me being the right tool for the job as between the resources that we represent as a team. And it's sort of purpose-driven in service to fulfillment of vision, mission, and purpose. So here's the difference for me between what makes that not leadership and situations where leadership is interjected. And by the way, I'm also like in this, I'm sort of a purist, which is you can put all sorts of modifiers on servant leader and all sorts of other attachments to the word leader, but it's lipstick on a pig to me. If leadership is in the center of it, it's all leadership. Anyway, the difference between right tool for the job as between a group of people in service to purpose and a leadership situation is that there is individual agency and consent in my version. That decision for Kevin to be the one to knock on the door was held by him and her. It wasn't Kevin making the decision. It was, hey, what do you think about this? And there was that moment of her having the opportunity to go, yeah, like, yeah, get me in, right? And consent, as opposed to all the things that go with the leadership version, which is governance, decision-making, and all of that stuff at the most proto level of humans being together and co-creating together, doing together, is restoration of individual agency, voice, and consent. And that's a non-power version. And in that world, there's no leadership. There's how do we arrive at consent? And there's a woman named Trey who has a thing called Winfinity. It's a bit overwrought in terms of her application of it, but she spent 15 years working on that. How can a group of people come to consent on two variables, on two dimensions that are key? One, figuring out what the common it is that everybody agrees is the next thing to be done or taken care of and consented to in a way that's not subject to power over or cognitive biases or stuff arising from individual attachment. And the other part is how to arrive at that consent without it being suffering from the flaws and defects of consensus and majority rule and all of that. And so there is a way and there is a version and there's no leadership in sight. Not required.
Really quickly, if you're told to go do that, you're not the leader. You know, and so
Correct.
you have
no, if somebody tells you to go do that, you're the led. You can't
Right,
have leadership
exactly.
without somebody being led.
Yes, but like Jerry has chronicled 70 kinds of leadership. I just wonder how many kinds of followership for alpha males have been cataloged. It'd be really interesting because it was not easy to learn, and I don't find anybody talking about it wherever I go. When I talk about it, it's like, oh, that's this curious thing off to the side. But it's a kind of thing you have to learn. And I could have learned it quicker and faster if I'd found other people who were wanting to be a follower in the role. Because we have this methodology, the field guide to transformation, and this role is called the connected evangelist. And his job is to open the door to rooms that the people you work with don't get in. Tell the story, and then they get in and tell the story and get the stuff. It's a real repeated role, but I don't see anybody else focusing on that particular role. You know, that role is continually valuable. And when we work with groups, they got to have one of those. They got to have somebody who's comfortable in the corridors of power and money, who can tell the story in a simple way with benefits that will get them in the room where the stuff gets given out, and then they shut up and they get the other people in the room. And it's a specific skill of followership that took me a long time, but I don't see anybody else focusing on that. And I wish there were more. But we have all this little kinds of, as you said, lipstick on a pig called leadership. you know. I'm a servant leader. Well, no, you're still just a leader. You're just trying to listen and lead. You know, that's a better kind of leadership. But you're not taking the direction. You know, followership is meaning that you are taking the direction and you can live with it, which is not simple to do.
Thanks, Kevin. Hold on one second, Judy. I did post the first follower video, the dancing guy video from Derek Sivers earlier in the chat, and I love the notion of followership. Judy, and you might be having the last word today because we're a little over time and we've got to fold our little tent here.
Well, I'm actually not gonna make much of a statement. I'm gonna throw out some notions for further discussion in a dual sort of mode. I see a tremendous difference between content and process, but participants frequently pay attention to neither. They pick one and they ignore the other, and it doesn't work. Similarly, leadership and followership, I think, is a very important concept. But at the same time, that implies that you need a leader, and I'm not sure you need singular leaders. I think that's a disruptive concept for our current society. And if we could abolish the word leadership and change it to something like influencer, would be a more appropriate and effective term, because as soon as you assert leadership, you encounter resistance. There's always a resistor in the room. And that person will pick up on it and feed the followers that aren't following. You know, it's just, there's a huge dynamic here. And this is a really rich and fascinating topic. So I think it's worthy of some continued discussion amongst those in this room and others.
The influencer gets more followers on TikTok.
Well, influencer is a word that's tiring out now in this era. It's interesting. There's a whole bunch of critiques of influencer culture and all that. It's very interesting. So the word has been actually kind of exhausted a bit in this last little social media stretch.
It has, but I think it's the only word I have to. I mean, another word might be facilitate, but that implies you know what you're heading toward, and so you can see how snarky this sort of gets. I think it's a really rich area for this group to discuss, though, because of the differences in experiences and perspectives. And I remember one time I noticed that a guy in a group could always somehow make a contrarian statement and have it heard, whereas it was frequently unheard by other people. And I've tried to figure it out, and it turned out that his entering statement was, I'm probably looking at this from a different point of view, but, and then made the contrarian statement. And only once did the person at the podium say, yes, it's the wrong point of view. You know, so I think there's a lot of skill in the subtleties of this dialoguing that are important if we actually want to influence any outcome. And to me, that's a really rich topic for us.
So,
and just to counteract influencer, the word would be influencing, the verb. And I just point you to Bill Smith's work with AIC, his AIC framework, which is appreciation, influence, and control. And influence is the pivot point in the center between appreciation and source, and control, which is the old power and all of that stuff.
Thank you.
Cool.
And the author again? I'm sorry.
I'm going to put a link. I'm going to put a link to the study right now in the chat.
William Smith. It goes by Bill Smith.
Yeah. William E. Bill Smith from ODII. I am going to request from this august but yet compact group that if I would love to have a topic for OGM on this. If you want to write up a 1-sentence or 1-paragraph description of what to put in the call, how to guide, how to focus the question, I would love that, and we can make that an upcoming call.
Good.
And we don't have Ken on the call today, and I wasn't able to quickly find a poem that fits the listening question. So with that, I bid thee all adieu. I'll thank Klaus for holding the reins while I couldn't be here, but it's nice to see y'all. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.